today's weekly live video. I've got my blue pen that doesn't match anything else in my room and my paper in case we have notes this week as people are rolling in. Thank you so much for coming to discuss the American Revolution. I could not appreciate your presence more. While we're getting underway, people are rolling in. I'll give you a reminder, the rundown. We are going to discuss the last 7 articles I published on my website, founderoftheday.com. 2 of those 7 are actually old articles that I didn't publish this week, but I reposted them on all of my social media outlets, and we will discuss all these. So, welcome aboard. There is one thing of note I'm going to point out. When I go through these, I usually start the previous Thursday and work up to Wednesday, today. And I skip Fridays because that's when I do Federalist Friday. But this week I am going to do Thursday and then jump to Monday and then jump back in time. In the description I put them in the right order. And the reason for this is, in the last week I published 2 articles about 2 separate gentlemen named Edward Stevens. Now I wrote these articles ahead of time and meant to publish them on Monday and Tuesday because they have the same name and that seems to fit. That goes in order, and this is America. Unfortunately, I was putting up an article last Thursday, technically Wednesday night when I put my articles up for the next day, and I just grabbed an Edward Stevens and put it up. And then when I got to Monday, I totally forgot about that, and I put up, who was Monday? Samuel Hodgdon. We're going to get to why I can't pronounce his name later. And then when I was setting up on Monday for yesterday, I was like, I forgot to do the Edward Stevens in a row. So we'll discuss the 2 Edward Stevenses in a row here. People coming in, thank you so much. As always, leave me a comment or ask me a question. That's what I'm here for. We're going to go off on tangents, I'm sure. Last week we went off on a great Aaron Burr tangent. That was a lot of fun. So please try and get me off topic. We'll make it into a game on these live events. If you could get me off topic for more than a minute and a half, you win my undying admiration. That's all I have to give right now. We'll see how it works out in the future. I see 2 of you already hit like. Thank you so much. If you would hit like while you're watching or right now, it is the best thing you can do for this channel. It helps Google tell more people to come join our conversation. So thank you so much. We're already almost 2.5 minutes into it. I shouldn't be wasting this much time, so let's get at it. First of all, let's talk about the Edward Stevenses. Now, the first Edward Stevens was from, Virginia. He was lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia. I would refer to him as General Stevens from here on out because after the American Revolution, he would eventually make his way and become a major general in the Virginia militia. So, because he did earn that rank in his lifetime, I am going to refer to him as such. Though during the Revolution, for the most part, he was a lieutenant colonel early in the war, and this is someone had recommended when I was discussing flags the other day, and I apologize, the name who recommended it escapes me, but I meant to look it up before this because I knew it was going to escape me. I really apologize, but someone recommended when I was doing some videos on flags last week, I did the flags. The Moultrie flag was one of them, and the Gadsden flag, which is also known as the Don't Tread on Me flag. Someone recommended in a comment that I do the Colpepper flag, the Colpepper Minutemen. And Edward Stevens, when I looked into it, was the commander of the Colpepper Minutemen. Now, they are famous for their flag, the Don't Tread on Me flag. And if you click on the link below for Edward Stevens General, the image there is the Colpepper Minute one. And it's kind of a combination of Ben Franklin's Don't Tread on Me flag with a snake and the Liberty or Death slogan. So, they're more famous for their flag. I also didn't realize how short-lived they were. They were only a militia until 1776, like January of 1776, very early in the war. They did fight in the Battle of Great Bridge, which was a small but important one. The Battle of Great Bridge, which was led by our subject, Edward Stevens, the general. The Battle of Great Bridge was a fight in Virginia very shortly after the war broke out in the North. And it essentially eliminated, while most of the focus was still on Boston, while George Washington was still up in Boston. This Battle of Great Bridge, led by Edward Stevens, got the British out of Virginia and put Virginia firmly in control of Patriot hands. which that would change later in the war. As we know, the most famous battle was at Yorktown, when we again got the British out of Virginia. But the Battle of Great Bridge, right at the beginning, got the royal governor and his loyalist militia, and essentially gave control for most of the war, or a substantial part, the beginning of the war, to Virginia. If you're like me, you probably, in the back of your mind, want to assume, well, the British were in the north, so the South was just taking, left to be to its own devices. But that really wasn't true. They were being ruled by Britain for at least several decades, if not a century or two before then. So, and Edward Stevens got the British out of Virginia. He would soon be nominated and become a brigadier general. Actually, I should say, first he was recruited by the Continental Congress and fought to fight with the Continental Army under George Washington, and he participated in the Battle of Brandywine and, I believe, Germantown, if I'm not mistaken. And then after that, he actually left the Continental Army to go back to Virginia because the Virginia militia offered him the position of brigadier general, and a better position is a better position. So he took that. And when I was writing this article, I said, I know the name Edward Stevens. How do I know this name? And I actually looked through my old articles and realized he was the one who was saved by Jack Jewett. So we are going to talk about a bonus founder right now. Jack Jewett was an everyday soldier in the Continental Army who, the tale goes, was taking a nap outside of a tavern in Virginia. And he was awoken by the sound of horses. And he ran over and checked. And he saw that it was British horses, and the British army were making moves. Remember how earlier I said Edward Stevens was able to get the British out of Virginia? Well, they came back to Virginia. And they came and they conquered Williamsburg, and then Governor Thomas Jefferson and the rest of the Virginia government fled Virginia to Charlottesville. And the British were now on their way to follow the government from Williamsburg to Charlottesville, and it just so happens that Jack Jewett was taking a nap, and or perhaps I should better say sleeping for the night out in the grass in front of this tavern. I guess people were more comfortable about doing that kind of thing those days. And Jewett got up, saw it was the British, and took the back roads to Charlottesville to warn people. Fortunately, he was from Charlottesville, and his father owned a tavern in Charlottesville. So while the British were marching down the main road, he was able to take his horse quicker down back roads and got there just in the nick of time. First, he went to Monticello and warned Governor Jefferson, hey, they're coming. And Jefferson was able to get his family out and himself out quickly. And then Jewett rode down to the village where his father owned a tavern that happened to have a bunch of the government, the politicians working for the government who evacuated Williamsburg, staying at his dad's tavern. Super convenient. So he tells them to get out, and they all start getting out. But our friend, Edward Stevens, had been injured earlier in the war. He was wounded, I believe, at the Battle of Gulliford Courthouse. Yes, the Battle of Gulliford Courthouse. He had been wounded, and he was staying. Where was he staying to recuperate? Well, in Charlottesville, and he was one of the people warned. Unfortunately, he was pretty badly hurt, and he was trying to get away with everyone else, but then the British started catching up. Fortunately, he was in plain clothes, and even more fortunately, Jack Jewett, the midnight rider who had just come to warn the city the British were coming, saw he was being chased by the British, and Jewett rode out and caused a distraction in his uniform, and the British decided to chase this guy in his uniform instead of that old man who looked kind of, well, not old man, but that older gentleman who looked hurt and was in plain clothes. They weren't sure who he was. He was in plain clothes. He could have been anybody. So instead they chased Jack Jewett, who not only saved the day warning the government the British were coming, but probably saved Edward Stevens, the general's, life. So that's our bonus founder today, Jack Jewett. And that's the story of Edward Stevens, who I said would participate in the Virginia government for a little bit later in life, but mostly was in the militia, and eventually was promoted to Major General of the Virginia militia. So, an underappreciated founder who we needed to study, because that's what we do here at Founder of the Day. Now, as I said earlier, I'm going to skip to the future. I'm going to look to see if there's any questions. Not yet. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for hitting like. I appreciate you all so very much. I'm going to skip ahead in the week to an article I published on Monday about another Edward Stevens. Totally unrelated. Probably didn't know each other. This gentleman I don't think ever went to Virginia, to be honest with you. And this Edward Stevens is probably, well, I wouldn't say more famous, but famous in different circles, because he had a famous adopted sibling, Alexander Hamilton. Now, if you know about Alexander Hamilton, you listen to the play and this and that, Hamilton was essentially orphaned at a young age. He wasn't technically an orphan. His father was still alive, and they would communicate a little bit later in life, but he was, for lack of a better term, bastardized by his father, who left town, and his mother passed away when he was young. Now, he and his older brother, Hamilton did have an older brother, by the way, also, often forgotten. Hamilton disowned most of his past throughout his life. Later on, he'd be, like I said, communicate with his father a little bit, but for the most part, once he came to the continent in North America, Alexander Hamilton didn't relate much to his previous life. He didn't have a lot to love back then. But when he was a child, he and his older brother were adopted by a man named Thomas Stevens. And one of Thomas Stevens' son was a boy, at that point, named Edward Stevens. And Edward and Alexander were approximately the same age, and they grew up together, and they would remain friends for their entire lives, and would correspond for their entire lives. And we'll get to even more than that. So Edward Stevens, the physician, as I'm going to call him, became a physician. First, he went to New York as a teenager. He went to New York and studied at King's College, which, if you remember, his younger brother, Alexander, would follow just 3 years later, or 2 years later, to New York. Although Stevens seemed to go a little bit younger than most people and graduate early. What I read is he graduated in 1774, and Hamilton, I don't think, arrived in New York until 75 or 6. I'm not entirely sure, but I believe after that. I might be wrong. He might have been 74. But either way, if their paths did overlap, it was very briefly. But Stevens would go to Europe and study in London, become a physician. And then he would move back to the Caribbean, where he was raised, and become a physician there, and spend 10 years there. And it wasn't until the early 1790s that he decided to leave. And apparently he was considering going to South America, but was convinced to come to Philadelphia. And he moved to Philadelphia to become a physician just in time for the yellow fever outbreak of 1794. Whoop-de-doo, what a great time. So he becomes embroiled in a little bit of controversy. There were a few doctors discussing what they called what I've been calling, and called in my article, the Swedish method. It wasn't actually called that, but my understanding, what I've researched, is the original idea came from Sweden, and they were debating about it. And this was essentially get warm water to between 8 and 10 degrees, and 8 and 10 degrees, 75 and 80 degrees, and splash it on yourself in a tub twice a day. Now, this was not, in hindsight, going to cure yellow fever. But this was what one side of the debate, and Edward Stevens was on this side of the debate. In fact, Stevens said he did this to Alexander Hamilton, who he finally reunited with. They had corresponded all these years, and after 20 years apart, he moves to Philadelphia just as Alexander Hamilton comes to Philadelphia because the government was there, and he was Secretary of Treasury. And Hamilton got yellow fever, and Edward Stevens is the one who took care of him. And he did this by splashing him with water, and apparently he got better. Now, there's another gentleman named Dr. Benjamin Rush, who is probably the most famous doctor of the Revolution. He's a Declaration signer, and there's a book behind me with his name on it. I've talked about Rush before, founder of American Psychiatry, anti-slavery advocate, got a lot of things right, got a few things wrong. He, at this point, as I was saying, times were changing and people were experimenting with new methods of curing diseases. Dr. Benjamin Rush was still holding on to one of the old methods, which was bloodletting. And he thought the best way to cure basically any disease, although again, his thoughts were changing throughout his life too. This was a time of great change in the field of medicine as well as politics and industry. So his ideas were changing, but he was recommending to cure yellow fever a good bloodletting. And that also would not cure yellow fever. None of these would actually work. From my understanding of how yellow fever works, now that we know about germ theory, none of these would work. But there was a great controversy at the time during this outbreak about which method was best. In fact, Rush said he attempted to use a Swedish method on several patients because back then they used the scientific method. It was around then, so he was trying it, and those patients died, and he said, this is not working. But Stevens said, look, I cured Alexander Hamilton. what else do you need? And that debate went on until the yellow fever went away. After that, actually, Edward Stevens becomes, when John Adams becomes president, he asks Edward Stevens, the physician, not the general, the physician, to be a consul to Haiti. And this is during the Haitian Revolution, which was essentially a slave uprising, and they took over the colony. And Toussaint Louverture took over as more or less dictator of Haiti. And he went over there, Stevens went over there as a consul to make sure American interests were still being watched over. Now, they thought that Haiti was going to break away as an independent country, so they wanted to be on good terms with them for that reason. But also, not only, there weren't privates operating out of Haiti yet, but if things went wrong and this new revolutionary government didn't work out so well as it did in America, it could have become a haven for pirates. And piracy was still a problem during the American founding. I know it's hard to associate the two, but it very much was alive, especially in the Caribbean. So we were nervous between the Haitian Revolution and we had the quasi-war with France was breaking out at the time. So Edward Stevens ended up going over there and acting as a consul. And consul, I read, someone pointed out in some of my reading, consul is a very important word. Because a consul is someone who is representing your nation to an independent country. And so in essence, just by naming him consul and sending him there, John Adams was recognizing Haiti as an independent nation. Now this was never officially recognized, and Toussaint Louverture actually decided to remain associated with France because of the benefit of the French Navy on your side. Without that, I mean, Great Britain could literally just come and invade you. Haiti was not nearly as big as the United States, geographically or population-wise. And what's very interesting is not only was Stevens was able to make sure that American interests were satisfied and that pirates or privateers would not harbor American interests, but Americans were still allowed to trade with the nation, or not nation, colony of Haiti. Furthermore, the British went to war with the French, and a real war, not like quasi-fake war that we were in with the French, but a real war. So they started going to war. And that meant that the British consul to Haiti was not allowed in Haiti because they were at war. So Stevens, who I'll remind you, when he was younger, spent a decade in Europe and spent most of his adult life in British. Even the American Revolution during the war, he was in British-owned island in the Caribbean. I believe it was Antigua. And so he ended up representing the British to Haiti also. So he was simultaneously a consul from Britain and from America. And he was able to make sure everything worked out and everyone became friendly enough in Haiti for the time. So that's Hamilton's adopted brother. I saw a few comments. I think someone threw up a date. Wine in a warm bath or bloodletting. Yes, Matthew. Wine, and I forgot to drink various types of wine. There were specific types that I forgot to mention that you were supposed to drink with your warm bath. I'm sure it would help a little bit. Terence Hamilton came over in late 1772. That's right. I apologize. My dates escaped me. That's right. So they would have been there about the same time. And he went to school in New Jersey. Yes. He would have come over. He went to Jersey briefly, and then he went to King's College briefly, and then he went to Princeton. I might be getting the orders wrong. You know what? I've been reading so much about Alexander Hamilton this week because I don't know if you know this, but if you got Disney Plus, the movie of the play Hamilton is coming to Disney Plus this week. And I must have read too much Hamilton because now I'm getting everything, all my dates and everything backwards because I am out of my mind excited. Not to digress too much, but if you don't have Disney Plus, get it right now so we can all watch it at the same time and Disney Plus can crash and no one will watch it because that is probably what's about to happen this coming, I think it's Friday, the July 3rd, just in time for the 4th, I think is Friday. So I'm pumped. I can't wait. I was thinking about having some kind of watch party. I don't know how we would do that, but if that interests you, please let me know. So any hoozle, those are the Edward Stevenses. One's a general, one is a physician. A lot of the things I read about the other Edward Stevens, I did not know. The physician, I did not know I knew he was, when I first started this article, I had known he was associated with Hamilton, but I had no idea that he ended up being so involved with Haiti later in the war. So we're going to skip Friday. We are going to go to George Reid, and you'll forgive me, I'm going to take a sip of my coffee because I am talking a lot. Thank you. And if you like Thomas Jefferson, we are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. Check out my website. I have that in the link below. One of the things in my shop, one of my favorite quotes, because that's a quote that Thomas Jefferson said in his first inaugural address, and it's amazingly important because when John Adams became president, he took over for Washington, and they were both essentially Federalists. When Thomas Jefferson became executive, that was a different political party. And throughout history, when power transfers from one party to another party, it's almost always violent. But this is one of the first times in world history, and it's become a lot more common nowadays, but thanks to Thomas Jefferson, the transfer of power from one party to another was nonviolent. And what he said was, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists, we're not going to take out, we're not going to throw our opponents in jail. We're not going to take out revenge on the people who used to be in charge. We are Americans. Not to digress too much. But let's talk about George Reid. George Reid was from Delaware. Moving on. No, just kidding. George Reid was from Delaware. He had been essentially the Attorney General of Delaware for the Crown. He was the King's attorney. So he was supposed to uphold the law for Delaware. And then these revolutionaries start coming around, and he's not super happy about some of the laws. He also was in the Colonial Assembly, so he is elected to attend the First Continental Congress, where he signs the Articles of Association, also known as the Continental Association, which was the boycott on British goods with various other mechanisms to try and address the grievances held by the Congress. He was then sent back to the Second Continental Congress, and the grievances were not addressed, and a war broke out. Now, George Reid was very slow to come along with independence. In fact, when the vote came on the floor to vote for independence, George Reid voted no. Now, hold on, don't get too mad at him yet. He voted no. And this gives us the story of Caesar Rodney, which, forgive me if I'm repeating myself, and I am going to digress once again, because Caesar Rodney had one of those magical midnight rides, our second midnight ride this week. What are the chances? I didn't even consider that beforehand. Caesar Rodney is one of Delaware's favorite sons. He would later be governor, and he was a member of the Continental Congress, but he had gone back to Delaware to help organize the militia, because he was also, I believe, a colonel in the militia. And so he was really important to Delaware. But Delaware had 3 representatives in the Continental Congress: Caesar Rodney, George Reid, and Thomas McKeon. And when the vote came for independence, Reid was against and McKeon was for. That means Delaware was undecided. So they needed that third guy there. So they sent a messenger, and Caesar Rodney, the night before, on the 1st of July, because remember the vote on independence was the 2nd of July, on the 1st of July, Caesar Rodney got word, as the sun was setting, you got to get to Philadelphia right now. So Caesar Rodney, who, by the way, had cancer and had a sash over his eye because his face, like the cancer on his face, was embarrassing for him. So with essentially one eye, got on horseback, rode through a lightning and thunderstorm 80 miles overnight, get to Philadelphia, arrives after the sun comes up, walks in late after the Continental Congress had already started session, and basically right as they were starting to vote on independence, he walked in, slumped in his chair, they said Delaware, and he said, aye. That's how Delaware voted for the Declaration of Independence. Thanks in part to today's subject, George Reid, who was voting no at the time. I do also want to note, if you've ever seen the John Adams miniseries, when they're having the vote, and there's this very important moment, a solemn moment, where they're calling out each state, and each state is voting their position, and the music is swelling in the background, someone walks in late for seemingly no reason and goes and sits down as they finish. That is the attention to detail that fabulous piece of cinematic achievement does. There are definitely mistakes in that miniseries, but that is Caesar Rodney walking in late to be the tie-breaking vote for Delaware to make independence, a unanimous vote between 12 of the 13 states, other than New York, who abstained awaiting further instructions. Sorry, New York has to make things hard. Continuing here, I just want to make sure I didn't get any questions. Thank you everyone for watching and liking while I'm at it. George Reid voted no. And then a month later, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, on August 2nd, for most of the people who were there at that time, George Reid signed the Declaration of Independence. He realized he was outvoted. He realized his grievances were the same as everyone else's in the room. And just because he thought we were declaring independence a little early, doesn't mean he wasn't going to join the rest of them. There's a quote from Robert Morris, another person who did not want independence and removed himself from Congress on the day of the vote, but would later sign the Declaration. And I think his quote applies to George Reid too. It's one of my favorite quotes of all time. It's the responsibility. It's important to know, essentially. It's important for someone to follow when they cannot lead. It's a lesson that between George Reid and Robert Morris and several other founders who thought it was too soon for independence but signed the Declaration anyway, realized momentum is going this way. I can't always be the one talking. Sometimes I have to join the fray. And I'm glad he did, because there's a lot more to George Reid. Reid would return to Delaware and help write the new constitution that the new state needed. He was very quickly appointed the first president of the Delaware General Assembly. I almost said Senate. No. That's why I looked. Essentially the House of Representatives for Delaware. He was appointed the first president of that. An extremely important position. Again, he helped write the Constitution. He would continue to be sent back to the Continental Congress and was appointed a judge on the Court of Appeals in cases of capture. And what's interesting about this is it's the first federal court system in the United States. Even before the Articles of Confederation were created, this was a court run by members of the Continental Congress. Now, their only goal was essentially to decide what had been taken, what spoils of war, and more notably, not just on the battlefield, but at sea, what could actually be kept by the Patriots and given out versus what should be returned. And it was up to him and the few other people on this Court of Appeals in cases of capture to determine who gets what we can take, and no, give this back. That's a Patriot farmer. Give him his pigs back. Like things, it would sound mundane, but are very important to common people. So, I find this pretty funny. George Reid would, years later, be sent back to the Constitutional Convention. And he was a very fervent supporter of federalism. He thought we needed a new government. And his idea, when he got to the Continental Congress, was, why don't we just drop this whole state thing altogether and just be one country? After being essentially booed out of the room, he changed his tune dramatically. And he decided to, okay, if we're going to keep states, well, then I need to protect the states. And he went from being essentially one large state person. I guess he would have renamed the country to the United States of America. But he decided he started protecting the rights of the small states. Being from Delaware, one of the smallest states, if we were going to have separate states, then we need to protect their rights. So he fought during the Constitutional Convention. Was a very much the main battle was between large states and small states, both geographically and population. And the small states wanted to protect their rights, especially someone like George Reid, who said, if we're not just going to be one country, let's give the states the power they deserve. And did this fairly successfully. And when everything was done, he signed the United States Constitution. And what's interesting about George Reid is he is one of just a very small handful of founders who signed not one, not two, but three of the major documents of the American Revolution. The Articles of the Continental Association, like I always like to point out, it is one of the major documents. Continental Association, the result of the First Continental Congress, which essentially started the war. The Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. The only one he didn't sign of the four was the Articles of Confederation. That's George Reid. Oh, I almost forgot. He would be an inaugural member of the United States Senate, one of only 26 people to be an original United States Senator. George Reid, quietly, a very important... Oh, also, resigned... I keep saying, as I'm like clicking off to the next article, like my next page to remind myself. Oh yeah, also, he resigned during his second term as a senator to go become Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court. Just to throw that out there. And he would spend the rest of his life on the tippy top of the Delaware Supreme Court. George Reid, clearly a very important, much overlooked founder. Let's see if you guys have any comments or questions. Throw them in there. Thank you so much for your likes. Thank you so much for being here. I cannot possibly tell you how gracious it is of you to come and join me in this conversation. So, we are going to talk about another, spoiler alert, signer of the United States Constitution. But first, we got to talk about his name. This is possibly the best name. I'm gonna take a sip of my coffee for the suspense. Okay, I know it's weird to me to look at you while I'm drinking. Okay. His name is Daniel of St. Thomas Jenifer. Now, when you hear someone of something something, you think, oh, that's a guy who's from that place. But there was never a place known as St. Thomas Jenifer. No. His last name is Jennifer. His parents' last name was Jennifer. His first name is Daniel. His middle name is of St. Thomas. Daniel of St. Thomas Jenifer. I'm just going to throw this out there one more time. His middle name is of St. Thomas. There is no St. Thomas. Historians are unable to determine how his parents came up with this name. There were other Daniel Jennifers around, and they wanted to differentiate him. They could have probably just named him Daniel Thomas Jenifer. Pretty simple. But no. His name was Daniel St. Thomas Jenifer. I'm not one to laugh at people's names, usually. But, come on. Come on. Yeah, Tarot. I know. It's a great name. It's a great name. But let's get into why it's important. It's not just his name. Again, he would sign a certain particular United States government eventually. He was born to a fairly wealthy family, became a lawyer, and he was appointed in Maryland as the Receiver General. Now, Maryland was one of a small amount of states that wasn't a king's colony. Maryland was a proprietary colony, in much the same fashion that Pennsylvania was, which meant it was purchased and organized by a corporation to be run like a profitable business. And it was a profitable business for a variety of reasons. Mostly because it was essentially a country that they turned profitable. A colony, but, colonies were profitable for their mother countries, or what's the point? So, he was chosen to be Receiver General, and Receiver General was more or less tax collector, but it would be better to call it rent collector. Or not landlord, what's the name of the person who collects the money for the landlord? There's a word for it, and it eludes me right now. But he was collecting taxes, but really collecting rent from the tenants. Same purpose, but when you're the owner of a corporation, you're looking at it as rent, not taxes, because you ain't a government. You're a corporation. So he's doing this for a while, and then the British government starts taxing, and interestingly, Delaware had a little bit of a different grievance with the taxes, where it's, no, you don't tax us. You tax the corporation that's headquartered in London. We're paying rent to our proprietor. We don't have to pay taxes to the king. We're paying rent to the proprietor. Which is a little bit different than most of the other states, which were like, no, we pay our taxes to our government, and you can't tax us because we tax ourselves. Maryland was more... And this is an overstatement, an oversimplification, but Maryland was more like, no, like, we don't pay any taxes, we pay rent. That's why we rent. It's almost the same argument renters have today, where, yes, it costs more to rent apartment or rent a house today than it does to own a house, but with all the things you pay for owning a house, it can essentially be cheaper to rent at a higher price than to pay a mortgage and fix your sink and buy a new dishwasher. Take it from me. Back on track. So Daniel St. Thomas Jennifer, in this position, became very upset and became a fervent patriot early on in the proceedings. In fact, he joined the Committee of Safety, and as we've discussed before, committees of safety were one of several types of committees set up leading up to the Revolutionary War. The committees of correspondence were to keep in touch with the other colonies and other towns. Committees of safety were to organize militias in case we went to war. And when war broke out, the committees of safety quickly became the default, I'll say de facto governments. So he was on the Committee of Safety, and when independence was eventually declared, he was, much like George Reid in Delaware, Daniel of St. Thomas Jennifer helped write the Constitution of Maryland, and then became the first president of Maryland State Senate. I just realized that connection. George Reid became first president of the State Assembly in Delaware. Daniel of St. Thomas Jennifer became the first president of the Senate in Maryland. Interesting. They both helped write the Constitution, and then would later go, much like this gentleman, to the Constitutional Convention. Before we get to that, I almost made a different article this week's thing, but I figured I could talk about it here. Daniel of St. Thomas Jennifer was one of a handful of people who went to the the Mount Vernon Convention. So, war ends, George Washington goes home. Everyone pretty much goes home. They go back to their states, because under the Articles of Confederation, you weren't American, you were a New Yorker, or a Virginian, or a Marylandier, and Marylandy? I'll use a different example. A North Carolinian, or a New Hampshire right. Man, I don't know what people are called from more states than I want to admit. That's embarrassing, live on camera. Anyway, Maryland and Virginia were across each other on the Potomac River. And there was trading going on. And they had stepped on each other's toes at various times before this. But after everyone goes home, Hi, TJ. It's all right. You're a little late. It's okay. You can rewind later. We are talking about Daniel of St. Thomas Jennifer, and everyone else here can tell you that of St. Thomas is not a real place. It's just a very strange middle name. And I think I'm happy to repeat that part for you. So anyway, after the war breaks, after the war completes, George Washington goes home, everyone goes home, the states are taking care of themselves. But Maryland and Virginia both want to improve the Potomac. So they have basically a convention where they send a handful of people from Maryland go and meet some people from Virginia at Mount Vernon. And George Washington graciously hosts these people. And I do want to note who the people were. It's Daniel St. Thomas Jennifer, Thomas Stone, who was a signer of the Declaration, and Samuel Chase, who I think signed the Declaration and would be an important justice on the United States Supreme Court in the future. So Chase, Stone, and Jennifer are representing Maryland, and George Washington, George Mason, who I discussed in a video recently, and a man named Alexander Henderson, who was kind of a nobody. These 6 people met at George Washington's house. And this became known as the Mount Vernon Conference. And they discussed fixing the Potomac River, making improvements. At this point, although Spain was friendly with us during the American Revolutionary War, they weren't so friendly anymore. So they cut off our access to the Mississippi River. Now, many of the Southern founders who owned property out west in the Ohio Valley and Kentucky and Tennessee. And people were flooding there to start settling now that we had won this land and building farms and had lots to sell. And it would be very hard to sell it on the Mississippi River if you couldn't get down the Mississippi River. So they were trying to get it out to the Potomac River. And there were discussions about building canals. There was a different Potomac company that George Washington invested in, several people invested in, to help build a canal there. Eventually they would build the Erie Canal through New York for this reason, and there was kind of a canal race going on at one point, but again, different conversation, not getting on that tangent. New York won. Erie Canal is something you know. The other canals we don't, because they never got finished. Anywho, which makes me happy because I live just outside a city that's based around the Erie Canal. Anywho, they go to the Mount Vernon conference and they talk about, okay, let's work together. We both won this war together. Our economies are kind of competing, but it would be better off if we helped each other. And they did, and they came to an agreement to help each other make improvements, dig certain areas that were too shallow out, put in extra docks, things like that can improve trade, and maybe even build canals in the future. And they came to this agreement, and then what happened? These Marylanders and Virginians went to their separate governments and said, hey, we just came to this agreement, blah, 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 let's do it. And Virginia voted yes, and Maryland voted yes, and they did it. And they even sent an invitation to Delaware and Pennsylvania, who were also on the Potomac, and said, hey, do you want to join us in this? And then some people said, it would be a lot easier than all these different governments ratifying this. What if we just had one government ratifying this? And then someone said, we do have a government under the Articles of Confederation, kind of, that should be in charge of this kind of thing. And some other people said, well, there's other things that are wrong with the Articles of Confederation also. So as a result of the Mount Vernon Conference and some other outlying issues that needed to be resolved, the following year, in 1786, they called the Annapolis Convention, which had, I believe, 5 states come and talk. Now, this was kind of a bust, because most of the states didn't send anyone, and there wasn't a lot you could do without all the states. And the following year, they had another convention, and this time they were real serious. Like, guys, show up this time. We're really going to do something about these Articles of Confederation. We're just going to fix them a little, but we need to fix it. And it was like, okay. Except Rhode Island was like, no, we like it the way it is. We're really small. We don't want to change it. Everyone else said, yeah, okay, we'll come meet. And they went to Philadelphia and had what they called the Philadelphia Convention, which we now know as the Constitutional Convention. And it is, I'll say an indirect result, but a kind of direct, indirect result of this original Mount Vernon Convention 2 years earlier that our hero right now, Daniel of St. Thomas, Jennifer, went to and was an attendee at and helped organize. Everything went very smoothly. And the thing is, the fact that it went so smoothly was one of the reasons that they said maybe we could make more of a united nation. Now, Jennifer would not play an important role at the Constitutional Convention. He was, after Benjamin Franklin and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Daniel of St. Thomas Jennifer was the 3rd oldest person there. Not that old people can't talk, because Roger Sherman was, I think, the 3rd most, spoke the 3rd most amount of times, if I'm not mistaken. At least the 3rd most amount of times. But he was in a room full of hot-headed middle-aged and younger men. And he sat there and did mostly listening. But he was there for his sage wisdom more than his political curiosities. And he was an important member. And Daniel of St. Thomas Jennifer signed the United States Constitution and went back to Maryland and supported it during the ratification process, and Maryland ratified it overwhelmingly very quickly. Thank you, Mr. of St. Thomas Jennifer. So let's move on a little bit to Samuel Hobden. I'm looking if there's any questions. Not right now. Hi everyone, thank you for watching and liking and subscribing. I'm assuming most of you already have subscribed because you got the notification I was going live, because this week I did a little experiment and did not put it on my social media just to see who would show up, and you guys all showed up, and I'm so grateful. I can't even tell you. Excuse me one second. Now, we're going to talk about General Samuel Hobden. I looked it up. There were a lot of interesting names, and we're about to talk about another one, TJ. I even, put on I went on Google and said how to pronounce this name, and I still can't get it. His name is Hodgdon. Hodgdon. Hobden. I think it's pronounced Hogden. I'm going to say it wrong and differently every time I say it right now. Please bear with me. Samuel Hobden was a young man from Massachusetts who joined the Continental Army at the beginning of the Revolution and quickly became a captain of artillery and served under Henry Knox. He became very close with Henry Knox. Very quickly, he was promoted to field commissary of military stores. Now, if you follow me on the Twitter, then you might have seen I asked a question on Twitter last week, who can define very simply the difference between commissary general and quartermaster general? I don't have that many followers, but not a lot of good answers came back. Good answers came back, but they were very lengthy. So the best way I can sum it up is commissary general is in charge of getting food to the soldiers. And quartermaster general is in charge of getting basically everything else. So he was a field commissary of military stores, Mr. Samuel Hogden. Which, from what I've researched, and there's not a ton of information on exactly that position, but from my understanding, field commissary of military stores, his job was to specifically, for the artillery he was involved in, get the men in the field food. Not necessarily at camp, but the men who were out on different missions, making sure with the military stores, making sure they left with enough provisions to not starve to death and get back. Not always a possible thing to do early in the American Revolution when they went without food from time to time. But apparently he was very good at this because he skyrocketed through the ranks, and by 1781 was commissioned as commissary general of military stores. So instead of just being field commissary, he was now commissary general of military stores. So for the whole Continental Army, essentially, he was responsible for feeding and equipping them with provisions to not starve to death, which is, I think, fairly important for a position you never hear much about. Like I hear when I'm reading through these and in my articles, you hear quartermaster general fairly frequently. Like Arthur St. Clair was not Arthur St. Clair, Mifflin. Mifflin. What's his first name? Never mind. Obviously, we don't hear about him very often. I was going to say him and Nathaniel Greene. You hear about Nathaniel Greene being quartermaster general and then being put in charge of the Southern Department because he said, I'll be quartermaster general, but I also want to stay in the field. Not the point. Samuel Hogden was in charge of feeding the whole army, and he worked very closely with Quartermaster General Timothy Pickering, who would later go on to be an important member of George Washington's cabinet. Before that, the war would end, and Pickering and Hogden would go into business together and invest and speculate in land for several years together, and have many partnerships throughout their lives. And that was an important relationship because when George Washington took over as president years later, Samuel Hogden was approached to be the first quartermaster general under the United States Constitution. There were several quartermaster generals, as I just mentioned, throughout the Revolutionary War. But when George Washington not only assembled his cabinet, he waited a while to assemble a cabinet, actually. Debate as to why. But he did eventually need a quartermaster general, especially because the Northwest Indian War had broken out even before the Constitution was ratified. Up in the Northwest Territory that we had won from the British were still occupied by Native Americans who lived there, and they were violently resisting American encroachment onto that land. And like it or not, historically, the Americans went to war over this land, and they did not do a very good job of it at first. And Samuel Hogden was in charge of, now as quartermaster general, not just the food, supplying all of the equipment. Now, Arthur St. Clair, whose name I kept saying before because I knew it was coming up and that's what's running through my mind, Arthur St. Clair was military governor of the Northwest Territory and in charge of the Northwest Indian War for the American perspective. Now, he was receiving supplies from Quartermaster General Samuel Hogden. Unfortunately, St. Clair, even though he did many important things throughout the American Revolution, was a president of the Continental Congress and an important major general in the Continental Army. He is best known for what is called St. Clair's defeat, where he went out to fight in the Northwest Indian War and was slaughtered and lost a lot of guys and did a really bad job. Now, St. Clair blamed Samuel Hogden for not sending him enough of the right supplies. The truth is, a lot of people should take a lot of responsibility. Mostly St. Clair, because he did take an army that was not well trained and kind of hodgepodge and brought them out to get slaughtered. Shortly thereafter, he would be replaced by Anthony Wayne, who... Oh, that's either a firework or someone's invading my house. It's Happy 4th of July. Scared me a little bit. Anyway, Anthony Wayne would come in and take this hodgepodge and train them appropriately and win the war very quickly. But St. Clair did have a certain amount of gripe with Hogden that seems to be justified. Hogden did not know the ways of the West. I read certain things about, the types of horses they had in the West were different than the ones that they had out in the East. So things like the saddles didn't fit appropriately, and things like that, which I'm not an expert on military horses and their armaments, so I can't speak too intelligently on that subject. But a thing I could speak more intelligently of is there was this whole army that needed to cut down roads so they could get their horses and their artillery through, and Hogden sent them 100 axes that were left over from the Revolutionary War, which I'll remind you had ended a decade earlier, and these were not sharp, very rusty old axes that did not get the job done. This was actually looked into by Congress, but eventually it seems to have just kind of blown by the wayside and everything was dropped. I'm sorry to end so abruptly, but that's precisely what happened. It just kind of fizzled out. A few years later, after he resigned as quartermaster general, he took 2 years off, and then Samuel Hogden was asked by General Washington to return and take over as basically where he started, superintendent of military stores. Not commissary general, a different title, but really making sure that the military, which was now a little bit expanded because of the Northwest Indian War, it did shrink again, but now between that and the calling together for the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington had created another little army. Very little, but it was there nonetheless. And he spent the next several years of his life, Hogden did, feeding that army. He would then resign when Jefferson took office and retire to private life. Although he was, I forget the name of the company, I think it was the Philadelphia Corporation. He became president of an early insurance company. I know it seems very vague, but this whole time, as I said earlier, he was working in various businesses in his personal life with Timothy Pickering, and he did a lot of private life stuff too, but that's not what we're interested in here. We're going to talk about the Revolution. So that is Samuel Hogden. If there are any questions, please let me know. Thank you all for watching and the likes. And I have an excellent connection. That's great. No questions. We are about to hit an hour. Holy moly, holy cow. Let's get through it then. The next founder is pretty brief, and then we'll talk about the final Federalist, because it was the last one. William Peary. Sometimes when I want to write about founders, I'll sit down, and instead of looking at the list I keep when I'm reading books. Oh, I never wrote about this guy. Write his name down. Come back later. Sometimes I'm like, let's just get a fresh start. And I go to Wikipedia, believe it or not, and there's a list of Continental Congressmen. And I literally just scroll down on my mouse. And when it lands at a part of the page, I look through the names. And if there's one I've never written about before, I'm like, hey, who's this? And I research it. And that's how I found William Peary. He was a Continental Congressman. Turns out, just for a year, didn't do much. But once I start investigating, that only piques my curiosity. This is what I do for fun. So learn about the obscure founders. This guy's super obscure, but I found a very cool story, as I try to do with my articles, is find what makes this guy different. Peary was in Sussex County, Delaware, and the war broke out. He was a lawyer and worked the land on his father's farm. Request is missing. Did we have a problem? Did we run into a problem? We still have an excellent connection. I'm getting a weird message over here telling me there's a problem. I'm usually like 10 seconds behind. Oh, thank you, DJ. I appreciate that. Nope. Am I... Okay, I'm going to continue anyway, because it looks like I'm still working over here. Sorry about that. I still get problems sometimes, and I don't know why. So anyway, William Peary was this guy, and he was a lawyer, and he inherited land from his father and worked on his father's farm. But he joined the local militia in Delaware and began working on... Yeah, no, looks like it's good. Okay. Sorry. He began working on his father's farm, joined the war, and became a part of he supported U. Mercer's flying camp for a brief time. But then he was told by the Continental Congress to return to Delaware and put together a local militia, a Sussex County militia of 100 men. And the reason was Sussex County was full of loyalists. It was a loyalist hotspot. So what he decided to do or what he was told to do, was make this unit of 100 men and go essentially lead a police force and make sure that the loyalists in Delaware didn't come ruining things for the Patriots. That didn't happen. The British came through and kept having little raids around. And Peary was under the impression, and whether this is right or wrong is hard to determine, but he was under the impression they were doing this to mess with a local election. So Peary postponed the election. This is in October of 1777. He postponed it to March the following year. What's interesting is he was running for state assembly. So he postponed an election he was a person in. And you would think people might be like, hey, I'm not going to vote for you now. Actually, the people seem to really appreciate that, because not only did they vote for him, they voted for him to return for the following 8 years. And he spent almost a decade as an assemblyman after this police action where literally he came in with the police force and said, we're not having this election. Because he was concerned that the British would raid polling places and attack people who were patriots having an election for their country. and so he postponed it. And he ended up winning anyway. Lucky him. And not only that, but in his last year as an assemblyman, he was sent to the Continental Congress, which is why I found him on the list. This was in 1785, when really nothing was going on, because the Continental Congress, or the Continental, Confederation, I can never get it out. The Continental Congress called themselves the Continental Congress from 1774 all the way until the Constitution was completed. Looking back from present day, we like to differentiate the time before the Articles of Confederation as the Continental Congress and the time after the the Articles of Confederation as the Confederation Congress. But I can never seem to say Confederation Congress. Anyway, he was there when it was the Confederation Congress and nothing was going on. So, nothing to report. He went back home. And that's pretty much it. He retired. He became treasurer of Sussex County. And that's where he spent the remainder of his days. So, that is a fun story about William Peary, who is a very, very, very little known founder. I'm still getting these weird messages. I hope it's working. It tells me I'm working and I have excellent connection. I sure hope I haven't screwed anything up. And if I haven't screwed anything up, then I'm even more embarrassed that I keep talking about it, and you guys have no idea what I'm talking about. I will figure this thing out one day, I promise. While we're here, let's talk about the Federalist paper. Let's talk about Federalist number 85, a.k.a. the Final Federalist. I've read, researched, and written about one Federalist paper every week for the last 85 weeks. I started in October of 2018. And this Friday, I published the last one. I'm getting a little teary-eyed. Part of me, I've graduated. I've graduated Federalist School. I'm by no means an expert. In fact, I am still up in the air as to whether I start doing Anti-Federalist Fridays for a while, and write about Anti-Federalist papers, or if I just start back at Federalist number 1 and go for another year and a half. Just so I can really get it in there. Either way, I want to take a pause here. I want to recommend a book. I like to recommend a book I would recommend a book every week. for on these live videos. I think this one is fabulous. It's called Triumvirate. It's about there's a subtitle: the story of the unlikely alliance that saved the Constitution and united a nation. It is by Bruce Chadwick, who's written several popular history books. It's about Alexander Hamilton. I'm going to point out them wrong. I don't know where they are on the top. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. And not only their relationship while they were writing the Federalist Papers, but the goings on in the United States during the ratification conventions. Because the Federalist Papers were being written as ratification conventions were going on, as the states were ratifying them. And this is a brilliant book that talks about, it looks at the whole, very underappreciated, it basically looks at the ratification of the Constitution. And I've never found a book that does it quite like this, because it does it through the relationship of these three men, two of which are extremely famous founders, and one of which is not nearly as famous as he should be. You may have heard me refer in the past, I call them the Big Six, aka the most important founders. Washington, Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton. I really should call them the Big Seven and put John Jay in there. But then I should call them the Big Eight and add Robert Morris. And then I should call them the Big Nine and add John Dickinson. But I am not. I'm going to stick with the Big Six because that's fun. It's the catchiest. So I have a link down in the description below. I cannot recommend this book enough. It's super important. I'm going to get it up here because it was on my bookshelf downstairs. I actually meant to recommend it last week. Now, getting back to actually Federalist number 85, there's not much to say because it's basically Hamilton saying, all done. He does admit that there are a few things that were left out of the Constitution. He admits that there are imperfections. He admits that not everyone's going to be happy with everything. It's a compromise document. I should probably speak louder. It's a compromise document. Not everyone's happy with everything. Many people are unhappy with several of the things. But it is the best we can get. You know, it's not a perfect government. He actually says something, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says, it's not a perfect government. If it were perfect, I'd be afraid of it. We want an imperfect government. And he also points out that it can be amended. And yes, there are problems. There's no Bill of Rights. Maybe we should have had a Bill of Rights. He waits, if you remember last week, he waits till 84, which is the first paper where he's still contributing new information. The very last one is when he first talks about a Bill of Rights. Because he basically says, yeah, like, maybe we should have done that. And I do want to just say, there are certain things I learned throughout this, and I'm not entirely sure what I'm even going to publish for Friday right now. I usually just write about a Federalist paper. I don't think I'm going to dive into the Anti-Federalists. I think this Friday I'm going to talk a little bit about what I learned. But just to hear, the two main things that I found out about the Federalist Papers, reading them over the last year and a half, that I had known, but they really struck me the most. First of all, they really wanted an energetic government, especially Alexander Hamilton with his writings. He always talked about energy, and he wanted a government that was alive and could do things and like was vigorous and okay, let's make moves. You know, there's a war here. Okay, let's go to war. There's a problem with this state. Between this state, let's fix it. The government should be able to just do it. But he also wanted a government that didn't work. He wanted a government... We talk about gridlock today in government. The Federalist Papers wanted gridlock because they wanted to stop people before they went too far by themselves. They didn't want just the emotions of the nation to sweepingly change everything. They wanted reasonable people to take it easy. And not only that, they wanted people to conflict with each other so that checks and balances, so that you couldn't just make these moves that quickly. Like even if the government wanted to act energetically real quick, well, it still had to take its time because we can't give too much power to the president. We can't let the Senate run away with things. The House of Representatives, no way. They're voted on by the people. So, those are the really two things that I take away with. And forgive me, I might be repeating myself next week because now that I'm saying it out loud, yeah, that's pretty much the article I'm going to write for Friday. But yeah, so Triumvirate, great book. If you have any questions, now's the time. Here I am. Hercules Muscleman, you're late. Oof, dude. You're real late. Hey, Muscleman. Guess what? If you missed it, I hope you know that they're releasing Hamilton on Disney Plus this week, or next week, July 3rd. Let's all get together. Let's crash Disney Plus and all watch it at the same time. I was thinking about having like a watch party. I don't know how I would do it. I was considering maybe choosing a time and saying, hey, let's all start the movie at the same time and we can like live tweet it. If that's interesting to you, please let me know. We can leave me a comment, send me a message on any format, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, get at me, and I will, if that's interesting, we'll set that up. It'll be fun, I think. And we can talk about it next week. Yeah, yes, Mr. Muscleman. I am so excited. I've listened to the soundtrack tons of times, but never saw it. I don't know if you saw, like, the preview, the coming attraction for it, but it actually looks like they didn't just put up a still camera and film the play, like I was expecting. They actually, looks like they had a camera crew come for several times and see the play, and had many cameras and they're cutting back and forth. It looks unbelievable. Because for the most part, side note, when I'm not enjoying history, one of the things I enjoy is musicals. I grew up outside New York City and was fortunate enough to attend Broadway several times as a younger man. That's where I used to bring dates as a younger person. And I have a thing for Broadway. I like musicals. I'm a big music fan. Played instruments my whole life. And I love musicals, but they never translate well to movies. They're always bad. Like, always. And this one actually looks like they might have figured out a way to do it right. So I'm really pumped. Really pumped. So yeah, if you guys are interested in that, let me know what times are good for you. Because I'm probably going to hit play in the morning and watch it over and over again until the day I die. So, well, all joking aside, we'll probably have it running in the house throughout the weekend. You saw the play in December. Yeah. Oh, you have the videos from Chicago. You saw it in Chicago, Muscleman? You're the one I saw putting those up? Very nice. I scrolled through several of them. It's such a good play because I've never seen it. I've only listened to the soundtrack, and I know exactly what I'm expecting. And the thing I love most about it, and I'm not going to go off on this, maybe we'll have a different live video about this, because I could literally talk about the play all day. But the best part about it is there are several tracks. There are 4 or 5 tracks from Act 2 that if you put them together and listen to them side by side, it is the best representation of the Washington administration that's ever been put into media in any fashion that I've ever been exposed to. I don't mean the revolution. I don't mean George Washington's life. I mean the Washington administration. Between the rap battles, where they consolidate the real conversations that were really issues during the founding, the framing of the country. But in addition to that, the conflicts between Madison and Jefferson, like Washington on your side, is an unbelievable interpretation of how Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were feeling about the changing of the country under the George Washington administration. Because you weren't supposed to not like George Washington. That was not acceptable. And it's an unbelievable representation. If anything, that one song is amazingly important to American history because the way it expresses these changes. Furthermore, it's great. They're really good rappers. Fireworks scare me. But again, just to elaborate, they were able to... I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine and about who wins the first rap battle. Is it Hamilton or Jefferson? And it depends who you would agree with in your life. If I were alive back then, alive today, spoiler alert, I'm a Jeffersonian. I still think we should move in that direction. But we certainly live in Alexander Hamilton's America. We live in a big government, national debt America. And, modern politics aside, that is the nation Alexander Hamilton envisioned, not Thomas Jefferson. But I had a friend who said, no, Hamilton obviously wins the rap battle. And I said, no, Jefferson obviously wins the rap battle. And we had to look it up, and Lin-Manuel Miranda thinks that Hamilton won. But he did such a good job writing it objectively that no one wins. It's just the argument they had. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. So, get Disney Plus and we'll watch it. Something come in. Yeah, you saw it in Chicago. Yeah, I thought that was you. I really think you had a past life with these founders. Oh man, I don't know, TJ, if I had a past life with these founders. I've been actively trying to figure out if I have any ancestors who lived back then. Um, uh, uh, is it Janet? Oh, the name is escaping me. Janet, from one of my readers and viewers who is a part of the Biddle family of the American Revolution, was kind enough to help me do a little research and figure out. It looks like I definitely had a great 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 grandfather whose brothers were in the Revolutionary War. He did sign a don't, I can't remember the words. I've been talking too long. An oath of allegiance to the United States, which might be able to get me in to the Sons of the American Revolution. Though I should note, most of my family came over at random times. I am what the Americans like to call a mutt. I am a mix of basically everything Eastern European you could possibly imagine, or European that you could possibly imagine. I hope it's in my DNA. Hercules. Hamilton is cool and all. I appreciate what he did for our country, but I endorse Thomas Jefferson over Alexander Hamilton. Well, we do our best to be unbiased here at Founder of the Day, Mr. Muscleman, but, as I said, it's important to be open about where your loyalties lie. I personally, at the time, believe I would have sided with the Patriots, which is good, the Anti-Federalists, and the Democratic Republicans. Something about being a human farmer and having everyone go out and have their own plot of land where they can take care of themselves and have a job where they make a little money to pay their taxes and buy some luxuries, but for the most part being able to take care of themselves is something I admire and think everyone should attempt to do, although I don't like to preach and put my beliefs on other people. But I did relocate from just outside New York City to just outside a much smaller city where we are, trying to take care of ourselves as best we can. I'm trying to build a homestead when I'm not doing this. It's going very slowly and very difficult, but we're trying. Okay. Questions coming in. Good. If anyone leaves at this point, we're just going to take questions and chit-chat. Thank you so much for watching, but please come with the questions. Mr. Muscleman, I got to talk to a woman on Instagram who is related to Elizabeth Sanders. Why does that... I know that name. Why do I know that name? Sanders. And you're related to what guy? Did you send me an image, Mr. Muscleman? Because I don't see that. Who's Elizabeth Sanders? The actress from Batman Forever? No, that can't be right. Okay. I'm not sure who Elizabeth Sanders is. I'm Googling. Oh, Elizabeth Sanders Mulligan, as in Hercules Muscle Man. I get it. Oh, by the way, I did look, Mr. Muscleman, into if Hercules' first name was John or if he had a different first name. I couldn't find that anywhere. I'm not sure where that was introduced to you, but I literally have not seen it anywhere. I did not know his wife's name was Elizabeth Sanders. Well, guess what? I'm going to write that down. Just for you, Mr. Muscleman. Elizabeth Sanders. I am going to write an article about that. We're going to talk about it real soon. How's this sound? Does this sound good? We can do that. Yeah. I'll see what I can find. Now that I said it, I hope there's a lot out there. His son was John? Okay, Matthew, that makes sense. That makes more sense. Because I did not find, as I said, a different first name for Hercules. Cool, yeah. Anything else, guys? We're getting late now. We're at hour 15. But that's great, because we're having so much fun. I took a picture. I saw it on Wikipedia. Some dude said it was John Hercules Mulligan. And it sent a link to Hercules Mulligan. I mean, I did not see anything. Sometimes people mess with Wikipedia a lot. That's why you want to be really super cautious with Wikipedia. I've seen, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I've literally seen things that don't look right and refreshed the screen and it's gone. Because first of all, there are people who like to troll. Hercules Mulligan is fairly popular, especially with Hamilton coming out on video in a week or so. He's fairly popular now, so people will go to his Wikipedia page just to mess with him. And people will monitor his Wikipedia page to make sure he's not messed with. And you find this on a lot of people in really strange places. There's a guy named Michael Jackson who was a general in the American Revolution, who I wrote about a while ago. Very unknown founder. But his name was Michael Jackson. And you can understand how when you look at his Wikipedia page, it often says he was the king of pop. And then it doesn't say he was the king of pop. And then it says he was the king of pop. And I swear I just sat there and refreshed the screen for like 20 minutes. And it just kept changing back and forth. They were literally having a battle with someone trying to troll the general from the American Revolution and someone trying to protect his legacy. It was hilarious. And that's why you have to be careful with Wikipedia. Although, I will say, especially with some of the more obscure founders, I often start my research on Wikipedia, which is a horrible resource, except it has references at the bottom. So what I'll do is I'll glance through the Wikipedia and get an idea and see if there's a story in there. And then I'll go to the references at the bottom and see if I can use those, because many of them are free on Google Books. And then I'll also go over to, for every founder, I at least do a once-over on Founders Online, which if you're not familiar, the new National Archives has a section called Founders Online, where it's basically Google, except everything is a letter or correspondence or document from the American Revolution. There's almost 200,000 documents on there. And you can Google through it, and if you just type in a name, it'll pop them up for you like Google does, and it's an unbelievable resource. I would not be able to do what I do with Founder of the Day without it. So, I do end up there. I don't just use Wikipedia. Please. Excuse me. As we're tidying up here, were there anything? I'm looking forward to next time too. Thank you so much, TJ. Thank you all for joining us. If you guys have any more questions, again, I don't see a John Hercules Muscle Man anywhere. Feel free to contact me not only on YouTube, but all the social medias and my email. You can get it on the About part of my webpage. Feel free to email me if you have more in-depth, at-length questions you prefer not to ask in public. So, other than that, unless there's any other questions, I am going to cancel the stream because we're nearing an hour and a half, probably the longest one. I certainly had a ton of fun. I hope you did too. And with that, I guess I'll end with our quote that Ned and I came up with a while ago on one of the earlier ones that for everyone else who has joined us since then doesn't make any sense. And it is round bottom, which was a plot of land once owned by George Washington. Round bottom. So, for those of you still here, thank you for watching. Have a nice day, and round bottom.